In the city of Chicago, on a gray November evening, a man named Brian Thompson came home 17 minutes too late and 17 minutes too early all at once. Too late to stop what had already been decided, too early to know how much of it had been built on his own hands without his knowledge. He stood in the doorway of the Gold Coast townhouse he had shared with his wife for 7 years, and he heard laughter before he saw anything else. Bright, unguarded laughter, the kind he hadn't heard from her in a long time. Then he saw the champagne. Then he saw the man's hand resting on his wife's back, low, familiar, certain of its place. And then he saw his wife's face change the moment she saw him, the laughter folding shut like a door closing on a room he was no longer invited into. Lisa Thompson did not say his name with surprise. She said it the way a woman corrects an error in a meeting, flat, already past it. "Brian, I didn't know you were home early." Not a welcome, a recalibration. Behind her stood Chris Hale, 40 years old, dressed like a man who had never once doubted his right to be exactly where he was standing, his hand never quite leaving the small of her back. She told Brian she wanted a divorce before he had even set down his keys. No tremble in her voice, no hesitation. Just a decision already filed away, waiting for the right moment to be delivered, and this, apparently, was it. He noticed her ring finger was bare before he noticed almost anything else in the room. She had taken it off some time that day, perhaps that morning, perhaps in the car on the way to sign the biggest contract of her career, and put it away like a tool she no longer needed for the job. Brian said congratulations. He meant it, which surprised him more than her words had. Then he walked upstairs to pack, his hands steadier than he expected, because somewhere underneath the shock, a part of him had been bracing for this longer than he wanted to admit. It was in the bedroom, pulling a duffel bag from the closet, that a folded piece of paper slipped free from between old documents on the shelf. Lisa's handwriting, a date more than a year old. 4 lines that rearranged everything he thought he understood about his marriage. Call attorney after the deal closes. Prepare separate asset strategy if Brian makes things difficult. He read it twice. He did not yell. He did not run downstairs demanding answers. He sat on the edge of the bed for exactly as long as it took to let the truth be as bad as it actually was. And then he folded the note, placed it in the front pocket of his bag, and zipped it shut. Because what he had just learned was that his wife had not fallen out of love with him in a moment of weakness. She had been planning her exit for over a year, while he was still making her coffee, still believing the life they were building was a shared one. What none of them in that room understood, what Lisa herself had no way of knowing, was that the $33 million deal she was celebrating with another man's arm around her waist had been quietly approved months earlier by a senior consultant operating under a different name. A consultant Brian had built from nothing in the hours after midnight for 3 years without telling a single person in his own house. He walked out of that townhouse into the cold November street with nothing but a bag and a secret he had been keeping even from himself. His father's porch light was already on when he arrived at the old brick bungalow in Rogers Park. Adam Thompson opened the door before Brian could knock, asked no questions, and made 2 cups of tea with far too much sugar in them, exactly as he always had. Brian told him everything, every detail, and his father listened without once interrupting. The kind of listening that comes only from a man who has lived long enough to know that some stories need to be finished before they can be understood. When Brian was done, his father wrapped both hands around his mug and said the kind of thing that doesn't sound like much in the moment, but somehow rearranges a person's spine. Don't let anybody make you feel small, son. We build lives on respect, not on who makes more money. Then Adam told him something else. 5 weeks earlier, Lisa's brother had called, asking pointed questions about whether Brian had outside income, private accounts, anything beyond his college salary. Adam hadn't answered, but the nature of the questions told him everything. They had been investigating Brian before the ink on that deal was even dry, while Lisa was still wearing her ring in public, while she was still texting him from business trips to say she missed him. That night, lying awake in his childhood bedroom, Brian understood that this had never been heartbreak in the ordinary sense. This had been a campaign, coordinated, patient, timed precisely to the closing of a deal he had unknowingly helped approve himself. The next morning brought a strange collision of good and bad news. His promotion to IT director came through, effective immediately, on the worst week of his life. The HR coordinator who delivered it lowered her voice afterward and mentioned something she should have flagged sooner: a formal records request months earlier from a law firm citing Lisa's company, and a more recent, more pointed phone call from a man named Chris Hale asking questions about Brian specifically.
Kershad called his workplace 6 weeks before the divorce was even announced, not to help Lisa plan a departure, but to quietly undermine the only ground Brian had left to stand on, long before the conversation ever needed to happen out loud. That night, sitting at his father's kitchen table with his laptop open, Brian began pulling threads he had ignored for over a year. An old email chain, accidentally forwarded to him 18 months earlier and never properly read, revealed the truth in full. Lisa's mother had been involved from the very beginning. Her brother had run the financial surveillance. Their attorney had drafted a settlement offer so low it bordered on insulting, built on the calculated assumption that Brian would simply accept it rather than fight. One line in particular stayed with him. Given his salary and the absence of documented outside income, our assessment is that he will accept rather than litigate. They hadn't just underestimated his finances, they had underestimated his character, betting everything on the idea that he was the kind of man who absorbed injustice quietly and asked for nothing. They were almost right. The difference was a consulting firm registered under his mother's name, and 3 years of quiet, deliberate building they knew nothing about. 3 days after he left North Dearborn Street, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was unhurried, measured, the voice of someone long past the point of anxiety over consequential decisions. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Jason Langston. I believe we have something important to discuss." Jason Langston, the CEO whose company had just signed the $33 million contract with Brian's wife's firm. They met the next morning in a private dining room high above the Chicago River, where conversations don't travel to the next table. Jason placed a manila folder on the table without opening it and told Brian, gently but without flinching, that an anonymous email had reached his office 3 days earlier. Inside it were photographs, timestamps, hotel records spanning 3 cities, documenting a relationship between Lisa and Chris Hale that had run the entire length of the contract negotiation. Brian had suspected, the quiet, cellular way people sometimes know things before they're ready to name them. But seeing it laid out, timestamped, undeniable, was a different kind of weight entirely. Grief and confirmation arriving in the same breath. Then Jason played a recording, 40 seconds of Chris Hale's voice, confident, casual, certain he was speaking in complete privacy. "Once the deal closes, we handle the IT guy cleanly. I've got someone watching his accounts already. If we need to, we ruin his reputation at the college. He won't have anywhere to stand." Brian's jaw tightened until it ached. He made himself breathe. He made himself look out at the gray, indifferent river below until the room settled back into something he could sit inside without breaking. Then Jason told him the second half of the truth. The anonymous email hadn't only contained evidence of an affair. It had contained Brian's other name, Brian James, senior consultant, James & Associates, the firm that had completed the due diligence report approving the very deal Lisa was celebrating. Victor's team had taken 40 minutes to confirm the LLC, and the methodology matched work they'd seen from the same consultant 2 years earlier on an entirely separate engagement. Brian had evaluated his own wife's company on its merits months before he had any idea what she was planning,
and approved it without ever knowing whose celebration he was quietly building.
Jason asked him directly whether he wanted the contract canceled, whether any part of this was about retaliation. Brian told him the truth. Part of him did want to watch it all collapse. He wouldn't pretend otherwise. But the work had been honest, and Langston Global deserved to make its decision on real grounds, not on his grief. Jason asked one more question. Could Brian be in Dallas the next morning, not to consult, not to argue a case, but simply to stand beside the work he had already done and let it speak for itself? Brian said yes. The Langston Global boardroom occupied the 23rd floor of a glass tower in Dallas, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city spread out like a blueprint of ambition. Brian arrived early, took the seat facing the door, and waited. At exactly 10 o'clock, Lisa walked in wearing the navy suit she reserved for meetings that mattered. Chris a half-step behind her, her smile already assembled for the room. Her eyes found Brian's face, and the smile froze completely. 3 full seconds of stillness, her hands suspended mid-greeting, the court stenographer's machine ticking on, indifferent to the moment unraveling in front of it. She had walked in believing she was the center of the story, and in 3 seconds, that belief collapsed entirely. Jason introduced him plainly. Brian James, senior consultant, the primary analyst on the due diligence report that had made this contract possible. Present today only as a witness to the integrity of his own work. And then, because there was no way around it, Jason added the rest. Brian James was also Brian Thompson, Lisa's husband.
The projector came alive. 47 pages of due diligence. Brian's name on every cover page, every executive summary, every leadership evaluation, page after patient, invisible page. Lisa had built her exit on the belief that Brian was peripheral. Those 47 pages said otherwise, plainly, without raising their voice. Jason turned to a page dated 2 months earlier, a leadership risk assessment that flagged possible influence on Lisa's decision-making stemming from a personal relationship with a business partner. Then he played the recording again, this time for the whole room, Marcus's voice filling the space, confident and careless. After the deal closes, we pressure him to sign whatever papers we need. If he refuses, we move to Plan B, damage his reputation at the college. Once he's discredited, the divorce settlement writes itself. Lisa did not look at the screen while it played. She looked at Marcus. And what crossed her face wasn't the fury of a woman caught in someone else's scheme. It was the slower, colder recognition that she had never been a partner in this plan at all. She had been its instrument. Chris hadn't built anything with her. He had built it through her. A Langston attorney asked Christo leave the room effective immediately, citing the undisclosed relationship and its conflict of interest. Chris stood, buttoned his jacket with careful, deliberate dignity, looked once at Lisa for some kind of lifeline she did not offer him, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft, clean click. 1 empty chair remained, and the room moved around it as though it had never been occupied at all.
Lisa straightened her spine and asked Jason directly what Langston's conditions were. A full independent audit of Elevate's contracting process, formal termination of any further involvement from Chris Hale, her cooperation throughout. She listened, asked 2 precise questions about scope and timeline, and gave 1 single nod of agreement. As the room emptied, she looked at Brian one last time, her eyes dry but only by sheer will. He gathered his materials and walked out into the hallway, catching one final glimpse of her through the glass, alone at the long table, the projector still glowing with a report he had written months before his marriage ended. 20 minutes later, she found him in a smaller room down the hall. No portfolio this time, no professional armor, just a woman in a navy suit with the collar slightly undone, reduced to her actual size. She told him she had already called her attorney from the hallway, instructing her to withdraw the original settlement offer and prepare something fair, and that the decision had nothing to do with what had just happened in that boardroom. She'd been moving toward it for 3 weeks, since she discovered Chris had tried to quietly transfer a portion of her company's equity into his own name behind her back, using a stack of restructuring documents she'd signed without reading closely enough. She told him something else, something that cost her visibly to say. Years earlier, Brian had told her never to let anyone use emotion to take what doesn't belong to them. That single sentence, buried somewhere in memory, was the only reason she'd caught what Chris tried to do before it was too late. His voice, not Marcus's confidence, not her own ego, had been the one she heard when it mattered most. Brian told her he didn't want to destroy her. He never had. He only needed her to understand what she had thrown away. She absorbed that without flinching, the way a person finally lets the truth land all the way to the floor. At the door, without turning around, she told him she had been wrong about what his quiet meant. She had mistaken it for weakness and made that mistake about the one person who had never given her a single reason to.
6 months later, Brian was living in Dallas, in an apartment full of east-facing morning light, working under his full name for the first time in his professional life, both halves of himself finally allowed to exist in the open. He told his mother everything, the LLC, the years of quiet building, and she answered simply that she had always known he was carrying more than he let on. His father visited that spring, declared Brian's reading chair the finest piece of furniture he'd seen in 20 years, and on his last evening told him there's a difference between surviving something and healing from it. Surviving means you make it to the other side. Healing means you stop checking over your shoulder to see if it's still following you. A month later, back in Chicago for a work meeting, Brian passed a coffee shop on West Washington Street and saw Lisa sitting alone at an outdoor table. No portfolio, no armor, just an ordinary woman holding an ordinary cup of coffee in the April chill. He sat with her for a few minutes. She told him the audit had concluded cleanly, that she would return as CEO the following month, and she told him the truth about the anonymous email that had started everything. It hadn't come from someone trying to help him. It had come from her own assistant, a woman whose laptop he'd once fixed for free on a quiet Saturday, who had been searching Lisa's files for ammunition against Chris and stumbled onto Brian's name instead. She had sent it to destroy Marcus, not to rescue Brian. They had simply been standing inside the same story when she finally decided to move.
Brian told her he hoped she found peace, and he meant it completely. Then he stood, rested his hand briefly on the back of the empty chair beside her, and walked away into the afternoon without looking back. That night, in his reading chair by the window, watching the Dallas sky bleed orange into rose and then into the thinnest line of violet at the horizon, he thought about something his father had told him on the phone not long before. The best thing about the truth is that it doesn't need you to defend it. It only needs you to be standing next to it when it finally speaks for itself. He had spent years believing that love meant becoming smaller so someone else could feel bigger. What he learned instead, in the coldest November of his life, was that the truth has its own timing, and it does not require anyone's permission to arrive exactly when it's supposed to.